and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Matt Scarfo is a fitness advisor, performance coach, and movement specialist with over 2 decades of experience. He was interested in learning how the human machine was engineered, how it responded, how it adapted, and how it accommodated when exposed to stress and stimulation. Almost 22 years later, his curiosities led him to explore the most fundamental aspects of adaptation to movement and exercise, diet, stress, injury, and disease. Matt has also partnered with 2 of the major fitness education institutions in the United States and has coached, trained, and mentored over 10,000 clients. He is the expert editorialist at Status Fitness magazine and is also the resident fitness and nutrition expert at liftvault.com. His passion lies in understanding and maximizing human performance. Matt Scarfo, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
My pleasure to be here. What an introduction. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I've been looking forward to it for a while now.
Absolutely. Me too. We always offer our guests, we can read it a second time if you like. Just let me know anytime if you want me to read it again.
I appreciate it.
I didn't get through the introduction without stumbling a little bit. I'm a little bit out of sorts. This is an away game for me. My normal podcasting spot is on the ground in front of my cycle clothes, and about 3 feet away from that is a staircase that is literally being sawed into as we're replacing the flooring. So I'm in a totally different spot. Have you ever watched the movie Borat?
I have.
Yeah, you know when he comes to America for the first time and he sits in a chair in his hotel room and he's like, king of the castle, I have a chair. That's kind of how I feel right now.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. It's one of my clients actually who allowed me to take up their space. And I know you've done this for a really long time. This client of mine, we've worked together for 8 years now, and he was one of the first people to help support us when our gym put us on unemployment during the pandemic. And he's always, offered, to use his pressure washer or whatever. He bought equipment so we could train him at home, outside. And it's really amazing, isn't it? How some of your clients, before long, they just become family, don't they?
I think that's really the nature of the beast, that, there has to be, and it takes a little bit of time, but the rapport, it's a two-way street. And in order for them to really embrace your advice and our advice and our philosophies, they've really got to kind of let their guard down and welcome us into their mind. And when they welcome us into their mind, incidentally, they welcome us into their life and into their homes and into their lifestyle. So, it's one of the great things about being a fitness professional is the depth and the breadth of the relationships that we get to form with our clients.
I'm so glad that you mentioned depth. It's funny, like he's even told me, like there's close family members that he has that know way less about what he does in his day-to-day life than I do. And you just really build that relationship and that rapport over time. It's totally true. I'm so glad you mentioned that and you agree. You wrote an article called "Your Personal Trainer is a Fraud," which I absolutely loved. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I'm a personal trainer. So I already know I can't count to 12 very well, according to my clients, but I was curious if we could go over some of your concepts that you talk about in that article, and then talk about some things that, maybe you used to believe and don't currently believe. But before we dive into that, I would really love to have the audience listen to your own personal story and how you got into fitness.
Sure. So I'm 42 now, I'm right at the tail end of Generation X, and back in 1999, just prior to 1999, I had some troubles in high school. I didn't really have a very successful school career. I'm largely self-educated and self-actuating, and I dropped out of high school at a pretty young age. And my mother, God rest her soul, as upset as she was about that, she was supportive in me continuing to follow my own curiosities and continuing to, I guess, explore the world and find myself. And I was working out in their basement. I still lived at home at the time. I was working out in my parents' basement, and my mom came downstairs one day, and I was a bit of a troublemaker. I did some things that, not necessarily too proud of at this point. I certainly won't tell my kids about it for another couple of decades.
Good call.
But she came downstairs and she said, I know what you're doing, and it's not okay. Furthermore, it's not okay that you know that I know what you're doing. So why don't you pursue a career in fitness? you read a lot of books, you do a lot of research, you exercise every day. You're a great resource for the people around you when it comes to fitness. Why don't you pursue a career as a personal trainer? And back in 1999, it really wasn't, it wasn't, the industry certainly wasn't as big as it is now. So I said, you know what, Mom, I think that's a great idea. So I went and I purchased the ACE material. And I got my textbook in the mail. I studied my ass off. And wouldn't you know it, I failed it the first time by one question.
Oh man.
And you could take that as a sign, really as a sign going one of two ways. You're either not cut out for it, or how bad do you want it? And I took the how bad do you want it route, and I battened down the hatches and I got back into the material and I read the book again, cover to cover. I renotated the entire thing and went back and I ended up acing it the second time around. And from there, Fortunately, I was lucky enough to have a friend of mine who worked as a sales director at a local gym, a big gym. It was a private facility, but it was a big box. And she got me in the door. And from that point forward, my question really beginning at the interview was, what's the most successful personal trainer? How many sessions a week do they need to average? And, what's the most that they've ever made in a year? And Andy, who was a great mentor and confidant of mine at the time, had told me it was something like 78 sessions a week. And this was back when we didn't do half-hour sessions. These were all 1 hour sessions.
Whoa.
I'm sorry, 78 sessions a pay period of 2 weeks.
Okay.
And I chuckled and I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm going to beat that. And she said, there's no way you're going to beat that. And wouldn't you know it, 9 months later, I had the new record. And for me, it was just what's next. So I looked at the next guy in line, personal training director, and I ended up lobbying for that position. And when it opened up, I got it. Sales director got it. General manager got it. And then fortunately, I found myself in a position where I could purchase a minority share of that company. And I did. And as a managing partner for about 6.5 years. And after that, I creative differences with my partner at the time. And I ended up leaving and starting my own boutique personal training and athletic performance center, which and unfortunately I had to close as a result of the protracted shutdown here in New Jersey. But there's a silver lining to every cloud, and I found it. Fortune favors the bold, and sometimes you just got to grab your sack and go for it. And that's what I found myself doing, and here I am. So I'd say that's my origination story. That's where it all started. That's where it all pretty much brings us to right about now.
Man, I mean, we could deep dive into anything you just said and have a complete podcast interview. I know that, sticking through things and mental endurance and, all the things that you preach, you also practice. And I just think there's so much life wisdom in what you just said and in your story. I do want to talk about some things that you have kind of learned and changed your mind about along the way. So the first thing I want to talk about is movement. How were you first introduced to exercise and movement, and what were some of the major shifts you've had in your career?
So I think like most personal trainers do now, when I entered the industry, there was the absence of the internet. We didn't have Instagram. We didn't have everybody vying for everybody else's attention on such a ubiquitous format. It was still largely one-on-one or small group in terms of the audience that you'd be able to address at any one time, or an audience you would participate in whilst being addressed. So when I started exercising, I didn't really have an idea or such a great resource to be able to find information to answer my questions. So it was largely a touch and go, learn as you progress kind of situation. And I remember exercising and feeling as though there was more stress on my body or on particular joints when I performed a movement one way versus another. And that began to pique my curiosity and really begin to nurture a philosophy of movement economics, which I hold very dear and which I coach to my clients now. And, realizing that, for example, when we squat, if we've got our weight really far forward on our feet, on our toes, and our knees are flexed tremendously, that when we stand up, we feel that stress in our knee. We don't feel it in our glutes. We don't feel it in the muscles. We feel it in the machinery. And in that, my curiosities just kind of grew. And I figured, what are other ways that I'm doing exercises or that people are doing exercises where the machine is really fighting against itself. And I began to really experiment with my own movements, experiment with my clients' movements, and take it from there and develop this philosophy of economic movement and making sure that, you'll find that when an exercise feels right, it just clicks. And we've got a little bit of margin of error within that kind of clicking, but nonetheless, we know when we're out of form and we know when we feel like we're in form. And so I just explored all kinds of movement, dynamic movement, specific movements, and really began to hone this and refine this understanding of the body and how it moves and how it really does prefer economy over everything else, and try to figure out ways to nurture that and to develop those economies. So that way the efforts that we're doing in the gym and that we're doing with everything else are really streamlined and really more to the point of what our overall goal is without wasting energy or wasting effort or wasting resources.
Wow. I mean, once you're in the industry for as long as both of I have, you certainly several years more than I have, but inevitably you're going to have the same certifications. We both have, some of the same letters behind our name. And one of them is NASM. And I remember, that was my very first personal training certification. And they teach you, this is a squat. I'm so glad you used squat because I think that's a great example. And there wasn't two ways to do a squat. There is one way to do a squat. Here's the correct form, and any other form that's not this is incorrect. And it wasn't until several years later when I added my kettlebell cert that the kettlebell instructor told us let these people kind of figure it out. Don't just jump in and start, correcting everything. As long as they're not going to get hurt, let them kind of sort it out and find their own way to move. So my question is, do you correct people more now or more when you first got started?
That's such a great question. I corrected more people then than I do now. I like to take, just like with my parenting, I like to take a tact of showing you where to look, but not showing you what to see. Because if I'm telling you what to see, it's biased and it's not contextual. Where sure, there's a perfect squat, but by and large, a lot of people aren't able to attain the proper squat for a number of different reasons, whether muscle overactivity, underactivity, they've got other mechanical issues. So it's got to be taken large part in the context of the client and in their movement. And we can work towards a more perfect squat, but to drill in that you're doing it wrong unless you're doing it this way, I think is counter to the overall goal, which is progress rather than perfection. We'll never achieve perfection, but it's important to strive for progress. If you were to watch me do a set of squats, not every rep is going to look exactly the same. And that's because I'm experimenting with the nuances. I might fall out of form because my attention is on my ankle instead of my hips, but it's intentionally on my ankle because I felt something funny there during the last repetition. So as long as we're increasing the quality of our average movement or our average repetition, I think that is progress and that is success. So I wouldn't say that I correct so much as I guide now. Back in the day, there's a certain amount of ego involved in feeling like you're a professional and you're the expert. And it took years for that to kind of wash out. But I found myself back then really being a little bit more hardline in my absence of a grander understanding of the human machine and human movement and human movement economics.
The further away from the shore you go, the deeper the water gets. I thought I knew everything at one point.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think about it this way too. Like if you take somebody from Hungary or who has a Hungarian heritage, they probably wouldn't do that great in a yoga class. And by the same token, like if you take somebody from India with that type of heritage and put them in a powerlifting competition, they're probably not going to win. Those hip sockets, the way they've developed have just been different. It just is what it is. Those are two different bodies that are going to move differently.
Exactly. And it's contextual, it's relative, and it's subjective in large part. Now, to say that there's a right, there's only one way to do anything, I think eliminates so much possibility and so much potential progress. Where, you know, one of the first things I look for when I am observing or doing movement diagnostics and assessments, or even cueing for that matter, is I look for symmetry. Okay, the form could look like shit, but I want to make sure that it's symmetrical, because if the form is symmetrical, then there's a symmetrical load on the machinery of the body. You know, and if we're looking at the spine, if the spine were a broomstick with a 2x4 on top, that would be the shoulders. If there's a symmetrical load on the spine, that's so much more favorable than having an asymmetric load on the spine, even though the knees might be moving farther forward than we would want, or the pelvis isn't, you know, oriented in the proper way. I want symmetry first, right? Small victories. And you really have to meet the clients where they're at, not where you want them to be. Because if you're trying to meet them where you want them to be, there might be so many obstacles between where they are now and that particular place that it becomes demoralizing and ends up making them feel as though they're never going to be successful. So if you slow yourself down and you meet them where they are, you can walk with them as they progress. But if you stand at the finish line and you just end up barking at them, telling them they've got to get here, they're probably going to find somebody that's got, you know, a softer touch, or is a little bit more empathetic to, you know, their circumstances, their body mechanics, and their abilities. So, you know, to your point, you can't just take somebody that's, you know, you can't take a fish and expect them to fly. You can't take a bird and expect it to swim, but you can show them what it would look like or what it would feel like if they were to do those things, and get them to be interested in it. So that way it's their motivation that's driving their success, not your cracking the whip that's, you know, forcing them to travel down this road, because if they move too quick, they might misstep. So really got to find where the place where they are, and be willing and patient enough to see them through it, as opposed to just expecting them, you know, what I told you, get your knees back. That's hard for a lot of people. It's really up to you to cue that proper movement. So this way they find the success in that, and they find these little nuggets of gold that inspire them and motivate them to keep going.
Dude, that is so well explained. I love that. And I love the fish and bird analogy. I'm definitely going to steal that. We definitely should be working to make fish swim better and birds to fly higher. Oh man.
Yeah.
So I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I'm a little younger than you, just a few years, but when I was 18, my parents gave me a TV VCR combo to take with me down to college. And I returned it to buy a Polar S210 heart rate monitor. I still remember it. I used it for years. So heart rate is something that I have been measuring. I worked on a metabolic cart for over 13 years, and, you know, helped set training zones and things like that. So heart rate is something that's very familiar to me. And based on your pictures and things you talk about, I know it's really important to you. How has your understanding of heart rate training changed over time?
So it wasn't very important to me back in the very beginning. Back in the very beginning, I started my career when I was 19 years old, and I was exercising regularly for only a few years by that point. And for me, it was more about the aesthetics of it. It was, I didn't do legs for years. It was, you know, biceps, back, shoulders, and chest. And I could care less about heart rate. About 13 years ago, 12 years ago, I began to run. And that was really my introduction to heart rate, was incidental to it making me feel like my heart was going to just explode when I ran my very first 5K. And I remember I came home from the run, I walked in the front door. My wife looked at me. She's like, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't know why the hell anybody would ever intentionally want to run that far." And it was only 3 miles.
Wow.
So, you know, but it was because my heart was, you know, beating. I was out of breath. I was breathing the wrong way. But it began, now I've got questions about that. You know, how do I manage to keep my heart rate down so I can make sure that the relative intensities, or at least what I perceive the intensities to be less. So I started to focus on training. I don't practice very much heart rate zones and things like that. I'm sure that there's progress to be made there, but I focus a lot on how do I keep my heart rate low during my strenuous activities. That's really where my attention goes. And I know because of some of the guests that you've had on your show that, you know, we can and they've talked about this, that we can affect our heart rate if we affect our breathing. And if we can try to maintain as much of a restful breathing pace as possible in through the nose and out through the nose, and incorporating a few different techniques to kind of, ratchet it down when we need to, that the perceived intensity can be much less had it been otherwise. So I think heart rate training is important. It gives us another measuring stick by which to gauge our practice of intensity and also our progress. But I always caution my clients, not to say that it's not valuable. I think it is a very valuable tool, but I always caution people not to overcomplicate stuff, right? The biggest lie we've ever been told is it's not that simple, because it is that simple. But people make money on overcomplicating things and then trying to find an answer for the questions that they've made you come up with. When in fact, like, eating isn't rocket science. Everybody knows what they should be eating and what they shouldn't be eating in, general quantities. We don't generally have to weigh out our portions. We don't generally have to really focus on macros, and I'm 3% higher in protein today, so I've got to back it off tomorrow. That's not where the answer is. The answer is in habitual practice of doing things pretty right, not perfect. So again, like we talked about with the movement, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to make an effort in the right direction, and slowly it builds momentum. So with heart rate, it's very much the same for me. I look at my intensities and I measure that by how fast am I running, how far am I running, making sure that my cadence is okay and my foot plant is okay and my posture is all right while I'm running, and then doing the best that I can to keep my heart rate as low as I can. And it's usually a tug of war, but it's a game that I like to play. How hard can I work out while struggling to keep my heart rate as low as I possibly can? And that's really the extent of my practice with heart rate training. I focus a lot on heart rate variability. I like to measure it when I do my ice baths. I like to measure it in the morning and at the night, and while I'm doing my breath work. And that really helps. I think, at least for me in my exercise and my practice, it really helps me to determine so many more things that are valuable to me than training within particular heart rate zones.
Dude, you're right. Heart rate variability is amazing. I found it most useful when I was doing speed skating, which is absolutely brutal. And during a training block, it would show me, every day how much that stress was accumulating. And sure enough, 4 or 5 weeks deep into a block of training, I was pretty dead, and my variability was definitely showing that. So with the metabolic carts that I would use, almost always, I would say like 90% of the time, when we would ask somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 how difficult they felt like the intensity was as we were ramping them up, when they would answer a 5 out of 10, that would almost every time coincide with their maximal fat burning. And we also validate that it seemed to work really well with MAF zones developed by Phil Maffetone. We had him on, and he uses 180 minus your age as a starting point, and then you just hang out at that heart rate. But the whole reason he developed it, or had the idea to develop it, is because he would watch runners specifically, and they seemed to have this like magic number that would line up with their really good gait. And once they got that really good gait, he would measure their heart rate and it would line up with that. And so I think that's really wise, even if you're not using heart rate, just to breathe properly and to control your intensity. And you might notice that your running form is excellent at that intensity. So that's a great way to do it. And that's free, totally free.
Yeah, totally. And I think, again, it's hard to measure intensity similarly when we run as we do when we do weights. When we do weights, we've got reps, we've got sets, we've got a number on the side of the weight that tells us, how much is gravity going to act on this. But when we run, one of the variables is heart rate. Heart rate's going to increase as the effort increases, and breathing cadence is going to increase as our intensity increases. So to be able to measure your heart rate while you're running and give yourself particular zones for particular purposes, I think is extremely valuable for the people that's important for. And it's not important for me in my training as it stands right now, but it very well might be as my training evolves and as I look for new things to interest me. But I don't want to turn anybody away from that. Absolutely not. But it's important to know that it's not just the intensity that's going to change your heart rate. it's also the way that you're breathing, and if you're breathing in a very inefficient and uneconomic manner, then your heart rate really has to pick up the slack for that. So, we can have a much higher intensity if we can govern the way that we breathe than had we not governed the way that we breathe and just kept it, and then Mr. McEwen and Mr. Nestor spoke about this. If we can keep it in through the nose and out through the nose, we find that we've got much longer legs than we thought we would have if we were breathing improperly for the same activity.
Yeah, I love that. I consider you up with them as a breathwork expert. When did that start to come?
Oh, God, thank you.
I do. I've read your content. It's very, very good. And you talk about, nasal breathing and diaphragmatic breathing, and you cover a lot of that stuff, which I really love and appreciate. When did that start to come into your field of consciousness?
Well, I really appreciate that. Respectfully, I disagree. Those guys are like the oracles of that particular genre, and I look up to them greatly. So thank you so much for even mentioning my name in the same sentence as theirs.
Absolutely.
Breathing for me in earnest, where I began to focus on it and try different things to affect it. And again, follow my own curiosities as they developed by way of seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, how are certain things affected by other things. Probably the last 2 or 3 years. And it was introduced to me. I was watching, I don't remember if I was watching London Real or if I was watching Rogan, but they had Wim Hof on. And the craziest thing is I'm sitting here, same place I'm sitting right now at my desk, and I'm doing some work, and I had it playing on the TV. And I heard, it was London Real. And I heard Mr. Hof talking, saying, or whatever the guy's name was on London Real, said, why don't you walk us through one of your breathing practices now, just so our audience can get a sense of what it is and how it works. So I'm like, all right, thinking that it was complete bullshit, right, at first, because, you made all these claims about being able to hold your breath for periods of time and being able to affect our sympathetic, our parasympathetic states. So I stopped typing for a second, and I did the 30 breaths. And while I'm sitting, after the 30 breaths were over, Mr. Hoff didn't say anything. And I realized that for about a minute and a half, I hadn't taken a breath, and I was completely empty. I had no air in my lungs. And he said, you probably realize by now that you haven't taken a breath. And I'm like, oh, crap, I haven't taken a breath. And from there forward, I was like, you know what, there's something here. There's something here that is paramount to our performance, not just in the Tumo type breathing that Wim Hof does, but in other breathing techniques. And now I had an itch that I needed to scratch. So I began to experiment with it. I began to pay very close attention to it. And I realized that when we lose weight, okay, when we burn fat, like, where does it go? That was a question that I had. It was just kind of lingering, a dot out there in the middle of nowhere that hadn't been connected yet. Where does the fat go when we burn it? And after doing research and studying and talking to people, I realized that, well, we breathe that out, right? That's the carbon in the carbon dioxide comes from carbohydrates, which, through a whole series of complex metabolic processes ends up being cleaved off and expelled from the body. It's heat, it's water, and it's carbon. So realizing that weight loss has everything to do with exhaling. Now, just because you exhale a lot doesn't mean you're going to lose more weight. But that's how we end up losing weight. Without breathing out, we wouldn't be able to. Our body weight would be pretty static. So that also kind of connected that dot for me and began to force me to ask more questions. What other kinds of breathing techniques are they? How can we affect our state by breathing? And not just how can we affect our state, but why does it affect our state? By what mechanisms does it do these things? And then searching, I found Mr. Nestor, I found Mr. McEwen, and consumed much of their material multiple times, and pursued a bunch of other authors and speakers and tried to learn as much as I can from them. So it's been about 2 years or 3 years, but I've jumped in with both feet. I mean, it's really one of the foundational elements of my coaching and my teachings is is breath work, metabolic efficiency breath work.
I love that. I'm so glad you brought up the point about fat being exhaled from the body. I don't think a lot of people know that. Do you today have a favorite technique that you really couldn't live without, or is it just really about any kind of awareness breathing?
So, there's a tool. Many different breathing techniques serve as different tools for different things. And what I find myself doing is I find myself holding my breath. And I don't know why this has turned into a habitual behavior for me, but I find myself holding my breath on an exhale. During the day, I don't even realize I'm doing it until I take a really deep breath. So, breath holding to increase my carbon dioxide tolerance, which helps me maintain a completely nose in, nose out breathing during all of my activities, no matter how strenuous, during my sleep, during my daily routine. And that certainly helped me there. One thing that I've been doing a lot of now is breath packing. Actually, it's a technique that I've incorporated over the last, say, 2 or 3 months, where we take a full inhale through the nose. We fill up the rest with a mouth breath. So, nose would be 99% of the volume. And then we're able to get like another 1% by breathing in through our mouth. But then taking a mouthful of air and then, pushing that into our lungs, taking a mouthful of air, pushing it into our lungs, and allowing our rib cage to expand and the structures around it and the musculature around it really being a way to loosen this cage that surrounds our lungs. It's basically this rigid cage around a balloon. The balloon's only going to be able to fill up as much as that cage will allow it to. But how the heck do we stretch that? Well, we stretch it by packing our breath. Now, for anybody out there that's interested in trying this, remember that too much of a good thing isn't a good thing. And to use your judgment, because I'm sure that you could pack so much air in there that you can create a pretty serious pulmonary problem for yourself. So please be careful with it. But it's a practice that I've began to incorporate and realize that my lung capacity has increased dramatically. It's already been pretty good, but it's since I've started implementing this over the last few months, I've realized that I'm able to take a much, much larger breath. And in being able to take a much, much larger breath and expose more of the surface area of my lungs to the atmosphere and to gases in my bloodstream and allow those gases to transfuse, that my performance, incidentally, has also improved dramatically.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a technique that freedivers use as well. We talked to Tanya Streeter, who describes the packing technique. She said the same thing, like, be careful with it. I'm a professional. I didn't know how to do this. She even blacked out on her dive where she made the world record, 526 feet below the water on one breath. Yeah, crazy. But yeah, that's a technique that they know about too. And I think that's a wonderful way to expand your lung capacity. I love that. We have to talk a little bit about nutrition, something we've already mentioned. It's really difficult not to get into the sticks on whose diet's better or worse. I think that's what Twitter is for. That's why I stay off of Twitter. I'm curious, some of the things that you maybe believed about nutrition in the beginning and how that evolution, kind of changed your mind over time.
Yeah. So when I first entered the scene as a fitness professional, I was pretty hard set on 25% protein, 10% fat, 65% carbs. And I know that everybody out there has got an argument one way or the other as to what's appropriate, what's not, situation dependent or not. It's one of those things where, much like who you voted for and your opinion on vaccines, it's something that many people will almost get into fist fights over because, this is the way that you do it. We've got the keto freaks out there that that's the only way to do it. We've got, the vegans out there, that's the only way to do it. When the fact is that, or at least the realization that I've come to over the years is that it's really about gut health. It boils down to gut health. And that if you can keep your microbiome happy and healthy, that you can keep your body healthy and this human machine healthy. Now, what does that mean in proportions of different foods? Well, we have a gallbladder that we don't want to overstress, right? We have a pancreas that we don't want to overstress. So those would really be a relative tolerable upper limit for an individual. And that's very individualized. Not everything works the same on everybody. But at the end of the day, with what it is, 70, 80% of our immune system sitting on the other side of this one cell wall thick lining of our intestines, making sure that nothing that gets through, and eating foods that are going to inflame our intestinal lining and create gaps in between this one cell thick lining, and which leads to sensitivities to foods, it leads to illnesses and allergies and everything else. At the end of the day, we have to cater to that. That is what nutritive food and a nutritional diet should all be predicated upon. And the way that we do that, and I didn't think anything about this back then, but the way that we do that is by eating a variety of fiber sources as often as we can. So, it takes a different bacteria to digest a potato as it does to digest an artichoke. And we need all of those kinds of bacteria. It's more important to have a variety of species in our microbiota than it is to have an abundance of just a few. And, we've got just over 600,000 different species of plants on this planet that are consumable and digestible by our digestive system. Over 600,000 species, but 80% of our diet comes from just 3 of them. No wonder we've got problems. No wonder there's this prevalence of cancer and peanut allergies, which didn't exist 30 years ago when I was a kid. Gluten intolerance, which may or may not have existed back then, but it certainly wasn't to the extent that it is now, the issues that it creates for people. Why is that? Well, it's probably for a bunch of reasons, but if we look at really the foundational aspects of human health and human performance, we would be remiss, we would be completely erroneous if we didn't conclude that it's the missing variety that we're missing from our diet, and that it is the artificial colors and the artificial flavors and the preservatives and everything else that we consume that's aggravating this lining in our gut. So whether or not you think that our digestive tract isn't long enough isn't long enough for us to be able to eat certain foods, or that, our intestines are too long for us to be meat eaters, right? There's arguments that vegetarians use and things like that. At the end of the day, it comes down to gut health. Gut health is nutrition. So however people want to interpret that, I think that there's another perfect example where the answer is, it is that simple. Treat your gut like it deserves to be treated. Our gut is sending signals to our brain. These bacteria are influencing our behavior and influencing our food cravings and so on. We need to really cater to them in a way that doesn't damage them in any way, but it also contributes to the diversity of these bacteria in our gut. That's where the answer is.
Sure.
So whether we do that by, protein only diet, or a keto only diet, or, vegan only diet, I don't think it really matters. I think what matters is if we've got a healthy gut microbiome, that we've got a healthy and optimally performing machine.
Sure.
And I would have never considered that way back in the day. I thought that fiber was to avoid colon cancer, and I don't have to worry about that shit until I'm 70 years old, when in fact fiber is important for so many other reasons. And that the sooner we begin to consider that as a staple in our diet, the sooner we're going to be able to operate at an optimal level.
Yeah, that's very well explained. Over here, we find ourselves a little bit more in the carnivore world, but I do get concerned when people do carnivore very strictly for a really long time. We truly are omnivores, and we can thrive on a lot of different things. And so I do think it's important to mix some of those things up. I think that's very reasonable and well explained. And yeah, I don't think anybody was thinking about the microbiome, 20 years ago. I wouldn't have even known what that was. It's so interesting to think, to your point, that like one cell separates you, which is essentially this like meat stick with a tube running through you, and the bacteria doing all the work. It's crazy. Such an interesting way to think about things. Also, can't miss this one. We love talking about this. Tell us about the evolution in thought you've had around footwear and the structure of the foot.
So this is something I've always actually thought about, was bracing the structures of the body is deleterious to our performance overall. And I don't think that there is necessarily an exception to that. And I remember when I did get into doing a lot more lower body exercises that people would recommend using a belt. And I was always reluctant to do so. And I rarely ever did. The same thing with wrist straps and platform shoes that people like to use for their deadlifts. And I get asked this question a lot. And the bottom line is that the second that we brace a structure, especially in our foot, we've got over 30 joints in our foot, 30 joints in that little thing down there, but it's responsible for holding up our entire body from falling over and maintaining, a bipedal stature. So when we brace any structure in our body, what we're doing is we're anesthetizing that structure. We are disallowing it from being able to receive signals from the environment, and we're disallowing it from being able to accommodate for those signals. And we're also, the things that we're trying to protect, we're putting in a pretty bad position. I mean, if you're putting a back brace on in order to do a deadlift or a squat, that's because you're afraid that your back is going to explode because it's not strong enough to lift that weight without it. Now, I am a Puritan in the sense where if you're wearing a belt or you're wearing shoes or you're using straps, you're really not that strong. And I know I'm probably going to piss a lot of people off by saying that. And you know what? I wouldn't be able to, you're right. I can't deadlift 600 pounds, whether or not I have a belt on. But the fact is that I've got a functionally strong body, and that the muscles that are weak are really being the weakest links in that equation. It's important to bring those up to speed and in a functional manner. And if they're too weak in order to perform at a level which I want them to, it's important for me not to give them the day off, but it's important for me to encourage them to grow and to develop in a functional sense, in their contextual sense. So the best way to get stronger at deadlifting is to deadlift in bare feet without a belt, without your hand straps. Sure, your grip strength sucks, but wouldn't you want to work on that? I mean, at what point do we draw the line and say, well, you really didn't perform the exercise because you're really not strong enough to be able to do that? Now, I know that there's different rules for different competitions and so on and so forth, and I take nothing away from those guys. But the fact is that everything that you've got braced is insufficient in and of itself in allowing you to perform the exercise if it hadn't been braced otherwise. Now, if we look at footwear, I wear minimalist footwear. I wear Zero shoes. I'm going to give them a plug because I'm an affiliate for them. But any minimalist footwear, I think, is preferable over a cushioned heel or something with a lot of support or something that accommodates for a flat foot or things of that nature, because that's the connection that we have to the earth. We've got just as many nerve endings in our feet as we do in our hands. There's a reason for that. That's not accidental, right? Imagine walking around performing all of your activities wearing mittens, because that's what we're doing with our feet. Is we've got them wrapped in this foam and in this leather and in this cushioned sole and all this other stuff, where we're unable to sense the world that we're connected to, how we're connected to it. And by bracing that structure, everything upstream from there is suffering. The muscles that are responsible for governing the ankle are definitely not performing at the same level as they should be. And because that's the case, it's the case at the knee, and that's the case at the hips, and on the lumbar spine, and so on, all the way up the chain. So if you change your footwear, you really do change your life. Now, the problem is that so many people are so far down the wrong road with this, where if they were to go to barefoot right now, it would probably create a lot of problems for themselves because their body is adapted and accommodated for an artificial environment where if we rip the rug out from underneath it, they're going to end up experiencing a lot of issues. That was actually my case. I went from running in a pair of Nikes. I used to wear Nike Frees, right? So Nike Free 2 was the last pair of normal shoes that I bought. And somebody had recommended a minimalist shoe. I just stumbled across Zeros and I bought myself a pair. And they were the only shoes. Since then, they've been the only shoes that I wear. I've got 3 pairs. I wear them exclusively. But I didn't have to break the shoes into my feet. I had to break my feet into the shoes, because I'm going from having that support, having that cushion, having an anesthetized lower leg configuration, to now my feet actually feel the ground under. If I walk on a pebble, I feel it. And my ankle doesn't have something holding it together other than the tissues and the joints and the ligaments and everything else that's really responsible for keeping the integrity of that joint. But what it allows me to do is it allows me to walk with a more natural gait. It allows me to run with a more natural gait. It allows everything upstream to be so much more functional and so much stronger in so many different ways, where my squat certainly feels a whole lot better. My balance is a whole lot better. My deadlifts, my weight has increased with my deadlifts now that, my feet are broken into the shoes. And overall, I just feel like I perform better. I feel like I've got a better connection to the earth. I'm not wearing mittens on my hands, walking around and trying to explore and experience the world around me. I've taken those mittens off, and now I can feel the ground underneath my feet. And I encourage everybody to do that in some way. Now, granted, you can't go from one thing directly to a minimalist or a zero drop shoe and expect there to be not much of a change at all. Your body's going to have to adapt. But if that means that you do your lower body workout with just socks on or something, just start making some sort of progress in that direction. And you'll find that eventually you'll build momentum, and eventually that momentum will build into speed. And that speed in the direction of optimal performance it'll be unabated, because now you've got a connection to the environment around you. You haven't anesthetized one of the most important complex joints in your body. Now you've got it able to experience and accommodate and adapt to this dynamic world and this dynamic environment around us. And that's the same with, wrist straps and back straps and, these fancy high heels that people wear when they deadlift. It's, you're doing more harm than good. You're not functionally strong. You're very specifically strong. And God forbid you deadlift, 300-400 pounds, and you've got a belt and you've got wrist straps and you've got your shoes on, and we need you to exhibit your strength in a real world situation. Maybe you have to, pick up a car, deadlift a car up off of a kitten that you just drove on top of. You're not going to be able to do that because you're not that strong. So I encourage everybody to get rid of that stuff, or at least begin to get rid of that stuff, and allow your body to adapt in the manner in which it was intended.
Thank you. For the listener, we understand it's 2021. And if you got triggered by any of that, I'm going to be with Matt on this one and just say, we don't care. We don't care. So glad you mentioned Zero Shoes. We've gotten to interview CEO Steven Sashin, just an amazing dude, super cool guy. Yeah. So we love their products and fully support them. So that's great that you're an affiliate with them. We love their products. You mentioned running earlier, and you getting into running is somewhat of an understatement. Can you tell us about the run that you did, the pretty epic one not too long ago?
Thank you. I love talking about this. So I was never much of a runner. Like I said, I ran that 3 miles at one time and said, I don't know why the hell anybody would ever want to do that on purpose. But I'm a bit of a masochist, and I like finding myself in these situations where we challenge ourselves, and we continually challenge ourselves and find that primal closet within our minds that we have to open and unlock when we feel like it's fight or flight, and our only option is really to fight. So I began to accumulate distance, but I never really ran much farther than, 7 or 8 miles once in a while. That was really the extent of it. And during the protracted shutdown here in New Jersey of businesses, I owned a gym, and I was forced to close it for, months and months and months while all the other businesses opened. Gyms and restaurants were closed in New Jersey. So in protest, my first foray into distance running is I ran from my business, which was in Morristown, New Jersey, down to Trenton, New Jersey, to protest. And I went to the War Memorial in Trenton, New Jersey. And that's about 57.6 miles away. Took me about 13 hours to do. Wow. That was, when was that? That was April 28th, if I recall correctly, April 28th of 2020. And after I got back from that, it generated a lot of attention, and fortunately the right kind of attention. I got a little bit of press for it. I was able to tell the story about business owners in the state of New Jersey who were really feeling the heat, and, something had to be done. And it wasn't too long after that where I looked at my wife one night and I said, how far away is the White House from here? And she's like, you are out of your mind. And I said, just wondering how far away is the White House from here? So we looked it up, and ended up being about 411 kilometers, so 251 miles. And she's like, "You're not thinking what I'm thinking, are you?" I said, "I don't know. It's a little too soon." She's like, "You better not run your ass down to Washington, D.C." So about a week later, after talking to a couple of friends of mine who were in the Army, Special Forces, always on their feet, traveling long distances, and a few other ultra runners, I told my wife, I'm like, I'm going to leave after my daughter's birthday at the end of May. I'm going to head down to Washington, D.C. And my wife, as all good women are, she was supportive, but she made no mistake that, made sure that I was no misunderstanding that this was a ridiculously stupid idea. And
she's right.
On the morning, I think, right? Well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, it was a hell of an experience. On the morning of May 24th, not even a month after my first non-official ultra running down to Trenton, I ran down to, I left my house to run to Washington, D.C. And it was really the second time I had ever attempted to run any kind of distance like that. First one being down to Trenton. And took me just over 9 days, averaged about a marathon a day to get down there. And I got there the Monday after, well, really the day after the George Floyd protests had reached the Capitol. I was running down there on behalf of business owners in New Jersey, really all across the country, and really trying to take their burdens down there with me, hoping to get a little bit of airtime when I got down there to explain the dire situation that, the shutdown is killing livelihoods and destroying families and businesses. And when you know it, that the Thursday before I got down there, we're looking at a national crisis, and the message that I was bringing down there was overshadowed by a much larger, much more important conversation that we were to have on a national scale. So I got down there. Nobody was waiting for me, and nobody was waiting to hear my story, which was fine, because about halfway through it turned into a personal odyssey, and I wasn't doing it really for anybody else at that point. I was doing it for me, and it was crazy. I hit a wall on the way down there. Dave Goggins, thank you, sir, helped me a little bit on my way down there with some of his podcasts, and yeah, it was nuts. My wife, I would talk to my wife every night. I was by myself running down there. And I would talk to my wife every night, and she'd say, "So you're here. I have a hotel for you at 27 miles, and I have a hotel for you at 39 miles. Take your pick. Those are the only two you got." And I would set out, and I would run to the next hotel, and I would set up camp and do it again the next day. My wife had two rules. She said, one, you're not allowed to run when it's dark, because you've got a family with children that you've got to be worried about. So you can go, but you can't run when it's dark, and you have to sleep in a bed every night. Those were her two rules. Because originally I was going to run down there and just camp out on the side of the road or something as I made my way down. But she shit canned that idea pretty quick, and I ended up staying in a hotel every night.
Wow. What an amazing story and an amazing journey. And I'm so glad that you still found that you got a lot out of that. My absolute favorite podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, is called The Forward by Lance Armstrong. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But he recently, well, first of all, the concept of the forward is moving forward, failing forward. If I'm going to fall, I'm falling face first. I'm going to try, I'm going to attempt it. And, with Lance's life being very tumultuous and all the things that came out about the doping scandals, he decided after a while that he needed to move forward. And, he helps bring his message. He's gone through a lot of personal growth, and he interviews really interesting people about that same thing. And he recently had an interview with Wolfgang Puck, the famous chef, and they started talking about endurance. And Wolfgang said something really interesting, that he thought that this generation coming up doesn't have the capacity to endure and to push through difficult things to get to, what is really meaningful in life. And so I'm going to ask you, in your opinion, what does the word endurance mean to you?
To endure, I think to transcend any reasonable expectation of moderation when faced with adverse and potentially dangerous situations. So it's not enduring. You're not enduring anything if it's enjoyable, right? You're participating, you're engaging. You're enduring when it starts to suck. That's when you endure. So I think that's relative and highly individualized, right? Where some people, they begin to endure the discomfort of running at a half a mile. And some people begin to endure the adversity of running at 30 miles or 50 miles. Like Courtney Dauwalter, she doesn't begin enduring for quite some time, long after I've began to endure. So I think endurance is putting up with this, is putting up with the suck. Like at what point do you really not want to do this anymore? But that voice in your head tells you that you've just got to keep going. And only then. You can't endure if it's comfortable. That's not endurance. Endurance is being able to just shut off your mind or just deal with it in some other way. But to be able to manage yourself for a protracted amount of time when things really get uncomfortable. That's endurance.
I love that. That is so well defined. And again, we have mentioned already that you live what you preach and wouldn't say anything that you wouldn't be doing yourself. You wouldn't give a recommendation to somebody that you wouldn't be willing to take on yourself. So I really love and appreciate that definition of endurance. This has been a very wide ranging conversation. It's been very inspiring. Love the information that we've gotten from you. What is one simple tip that you would like to leave for the listener that they can take away from this conversation and apply in their lives?
Man, it's usually something about breathwork, but you want to listen to James Nestor and Patrick McEwen before you want to listen to me about that.
Any of you guys are great.
So I've got they're fantastic. So, I would say don't overcomplicate stuff. Don't overcomplicate stuff. You don't need a Red Bull before you run in order to have a successful run. Okay. You don't need to have a special pair of shoes in order to do something. You don't need to have all of the things that you've convinced yourself that you need to have in order to do the things that you convince yourself to do. You don't. You need nothing. You need just the will to want to do something. Some of my best workouts have happened on an empty stomach. Some of my longest runs have happened after I ate a medium number 2A, which is a quarter pounder of cheese with a medium vanilla shake and a spicy chicken sandwich. And then I'm back on my feet 10 minutes later. So some of my longest runs have happened on a full stomach. You've always got the ability to do the things that you want to be able to do. You just have to get out of your own way. And by getting out of your own way, that means keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. You don't need to count calories. You don't need to count macros. You don't need to weigh your food. You don't. You just have to eat mindfully. Now, if that's what it helps to keep you in line, fine. But if it's taking up time that you would otherwise want to spend with your family or reading a book, then is it worth it? It's not that complicated. So get out of your own way. Trust yourself. Find your ass on your feet and find your ass moving. That's all that it takes. You'll find that once you're able to trust yourself and just get going, that the momentum builds so quickly. But if you stop yourself from starting at the very get-go because you need X, Y, and Z before the conditions are perfect, then you're going to find that that's going to be the case forever and for always. When the fact of the matter is that you've already got everything that you need. You've got it right now. Just get out of your own way.
Dude, beautiful. You and I have done this for a minute now and just have seen a mountain of bullshit that's out there and the products to be sold and the programs and all this stuff. And I just so much appreciate that advice and making things simple for people. I love that. They can start anywhere where they are, but as long as they start and take a step in the right direction, that's all we're looking for. Matt Scarfo, exactly. Awesome conversation. Where would you like us to send people to connect with you and find your work?
Thank you, sir. mattscarfo.com. It's a work in progress, but my website, it's got my blog there, a number of other good resources, other great resources. YouTube, Matt Scarfo. Instagram is where I'm most active, and I post daily, if not hourly, on Instagram. That's at Matt Scarfo. Everything is at Matt Scarfo. But, if you want to reach out, go to my website, drop your email in the subscription blog, or go to the contact page and send me an email. I always give out my best information for free. I've been doing this for 22 years. I maintain a white belt mentality, but I'm always willing to give what I've got. So, ask me your questions, come to me with your concerns. I'm always happy to give away my best stuff for free. So please just, seek me out. If you need a resource, if you need motivation, if you need inspiration, connect with me on a personal level. I'm here, and I'm here for everybody. This rising tide is going to lift all boats, and, everybody's along for the ride. So whatever I can do to help anybody, I can help. I'm always happy to do that.
That is amazing. I would highly encourage the listener to go to those resources. The website is amazing and well done. Your blog is great. We just so much appreciate you, Matt, and everything that you've done, everything that you've learned in your life, your progression in thought, and just, enduring, suffering, and being better for it. And we're so grateful for this conversation, and thank you so much for appearing. It's been a real honor. It's
been an honor and a pleasure of mine, too, and I wish you an abundance of success in everything that you do, and I hope that fortune favors you in all of your endeavors.
Well, thank you so much. We wish the same for you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.